Welcome to Four Seasons Gardening uh, webinar. I'm Phil Nixon. I'm going to be giving the presentation on garden pond critters, friend and foe. Uh, does anybody need to make any announcements before we get going?
Nope, go ahead, Phil.
All right,
You're
thank you.
good to go.
Okay. I'm Phil Nixon. I'm an extension entomologist with the University of Illinois, so that means I know bugs more than anything else. But I started with garden ponds when I was in junior high, so I've been doing this for quite a while, and have run across a number of various types of critters that will show up in garden ponds, assuming that most people are approaching this from the idea that they want to have nice water lilies and some other aquatic plants and so on. Kind of go into some of the things that are helpful and some of the things that are a problem, and most things you just kind of need to chill about and not worry a whole lot about. So this is kind of what we're going to look at. With me being an entomologist, I'm going to focus more on insects than most other things. And anytime you have a body of water, insects will show up fairly quickly. And so we'll talk about some pests and some things to do associated with that, and some other insects that are just out there generally in a body of water in your garden pond. Some relatives of those, and then get into some vertebrates that you're likely to run across, amphibians and reptiles, birds and mammals. Some of these are going to be problems. Some of these are not. A lot of it, whether they're a problem or not, depends on how you look at things and how you considering what's really your goals associated with your garden pond are. To start off with, one of the major pests associated with a garden pond is particularly as far as your neighbors will look at, and that is that if you have a body of water out there, they assume that you're growing mosquitoes and you're causing more mosquitoes in the neighborhood and being a problem neighbor in the process. These are, in fact, mosquitoes are relatively easily controlled in a pond as long as you have the right kind of fish, and almost any fish is the right kind of fish. There are other options as well, but the larvae are air breathers and are aquatic. They hang from the surface of a water and breathe through a tube, which goes up to their out to the outside air, and these are called wrigglers. If they're disturbed, they will wriggle down to the bottom and then eventually come back up to the surface to breathe. They feed on organic debris and tiny living organisms. They have fans associated with their mouths that they strain out to debris and feed on it in that direction. And so or will feed on individual debris as it comes by. They are uh, normally an important part of an ecosystem in helping provide a food for other animals to a great extent. Uh, After they're full grown as larvae, they will pupate, and they pupate into what are called tumblers. And these are kind of a roundish objects that you're seeing on the upper right screen, upper right photo. And if they also have a breathing tube which goes to the surface, so they'll be right up at the surface. And when disturbed, they will tumble. In other words, go over and over each other down to the bottom of the pond, and then gradually come back up to the surface where they can breed. Pupal mosquitoes do not feed. They're transforming in that stage from the larva to the adult, which of course you can see in the lower right picture. Um, Adult mosquitoes feed on nectar, both males and females, but in order for females to develop eggs, they feed on blood. So the same organism, same individual starts out life as a larva, which is a scavenger. After pupation, comes out as an adult, which feeds on nectar, and then on the females, when they need to reproduce, they become parasites or predators, micropredators, however you want to look at that. Probably the easiest way to control mosquitoes in a garden pond are fish, and but there are other options if you don't want to mess with having fish in the pond. There is BTI, Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis, which are sold as granules and as dunks. Many times they're sold under the name of dunks, D-U-N-K. These put in the pond will normally give you about 60 days of control with a single briquette or dunk associated with that. This is the toxin from a naturally occurring bacteria, which, when ingested by the mosquitoes, will tend to paralyze the gut and eventually lyse the gut and cause them to have food poisoning, blood poisoning internally, and things of this nature. So this is an effective low impact sort of thing. It really has no other effect on anything else except a few closely related things to mosquitoes, particularly black fly larvae, and might be an impact on midges, but generally not, because it normally doesn't do well in the debris at the bottom of a pond. BTI works best under clean water conditions, and your midge larvae are down in the bottom of a pond in debris, so probably very little effect there just because of location as much as anything. There are insect growth regulators that'll work, and Altosid briquettes and things of this nature that can also be available. These essentially mimic hormones that are in the mosquito body for control. But again, probably the best way to control fish, in my opinion, in a garden pond, our most way to control mosquitoes is by using fish. And golden shiners and fathead minnows are the typical bait minnows that you will buy at a bait shop. They'll cost you a couple bucks a dozen, and that's probably going to give you season-long control, so you can't hardly beat the price, the availability, or the ease. You just try to throw them in there. As long as you don't put too many fish in the pond, they're going to control all the mosquitoes, and whatever food they need is going to drop out of the sky in the form of other insects that fall to the pond and get caught in the surface. But in general, mosquitoes or larvae are eaten by fish to the exclusion of all other things, which kind of makes it easy and nice when we're trying to control mosquitoes. And to them, it's kind of like filet mignon or lobster or something of that. It's the absolute best food they look for, the number one food. And essentially any minnow, really anything other than koi, which is ornamental carp, are going to be very effective in controlling mosquitoes. So the bait minnows that you would buy at the store, the fathead minnow pictured here is one called a rosy red. It's a variety of fathead minnow. What you're likely to find in a bait shop are going to be more silver or gray, like the golden shiner pictured below it. But they're smaller and they're cheaper, and so, but either of them work really, really well. Goldfish work well. No matter how big they are, they still go after mosquitoes. Mosquito fish, Gambusia, is a fish that's been introduced into many temporary bodies of water by mosquito abatement districts to control mosquitoes during the summertime. They will tend to die out in the winter. If the pond is relatively shallow, and particularly in the northern half of Illinois, very likely to die due to cold water conditions in the wintertime. Can be easily obtained from feed stores and home centers and things like this. Occasionally you can order fish, and typically one of the fish you can get are mosquito fish. Normally you're going to get a bigger number than you're going to want for a small garden pond, but if you've got a larger body of water, that may be a good easy way to get fish that'll work. There are also non-native fish that are going to be effective besides goldfish, which is non-native. Platies, particularly those called varietas, are going to be quite effective, and these you can purchase in your typical fish store, aquarium shop, this sort of thing. They're sold as tropical fish, but they're not. They can handle temperatures down to easily 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In some research I was doing a number of years ago on controlling mosquitoes in ponds with fish, I had some in my tests that I got out there a little late in the fall to get to them, and actually chiseled some out of partially formed ice. It was kind of heavy slush, and those individuals survived just fine. So they are not really what you would call tropical type fish. They can handle a variety of different types of situations. I mentioned koi in passing. Koi can be something that you're having your garden pond for. It may be something that you added to your garden pond, and if you add it to the pond and you're trying to grow plants, you may now be wishing you'd never put them in the pond. They are ornamental carp, and like uh, the carp that common carp, they're bottom feeders. They will stir up the bottom. They will get into that debris. They will keep the water relatively cloudy, and they seem to take it on themselves to take any plant that's in a pot and make sure it doesn't stay in that pot. In my personal experience, we've had them before where we've put rocks as big as 3 or 4 inches in diameter on top of the soil in water lily pots, and somehow they managed to get them out of a pot, completely burrow into the pot, and pretty soon you see the water lily plant floating, a bunch of soil in the water, and an empty pot. So if you're interested in water lilies or lotus and so on, things that you normally are going to have in pots within your garden pond, koi are probably the last fish you're going to want to put in that pond. Goldfish will not be quite as large. They do come to the surface and are visible and ornamental, and in my opinion, they're a much better option than koi are if you're trying to have plants as well. If you primarily like to look at koi, then you end up with very few plants, or what you have are in baskets or something that the koi, floating plants that the koi can't get into. But they will disrupt if you're trying to grow water lilies. Various other types of fish can be used, and the southern red-bellied dace there is an example of a very colorful native fish that if you want to get a fishing license and go out and net your own fish, that is legal in Illinois as long as you use minnows, those in the family Cyprinidae, and as the Department of Natural Resources says, what you do with a fish once you have them is not our problem, as long as you don't put them into another natural body of water or body of water where they'll spread. So landlocked fish ponds, they don't worry too much about. Excuse me. Generally, most fish, if they're not tropical fish, will overwinter in the pond as long as it doesn't freeze all the way to the bottom. And it's been, when I was first setting up our garden ponds, we have currently in the early 1990s, we couldn't really find any good information about that, but what we've seen experience-wise is that generally if the ponds are at least 18 inches deep, which is a depth you're normally going to want to have for water lilies anyway, and lotus, the fish will normally survive. They're normally not going to freeze. Once in a great while, you will get a very cold winter in which ponds will freeze pretty much to the bottom. We had one of those, I believe it was the winter of 2013-14. It got cold enough that at least in my ponds in central Illinois, I lost all my fish that were outdoors. And
someone unplugged the speakers.
And so so we have a situation where occasionally you may lose fish in a pond. That pond was 33 inches deep, but it's very unusual for ones to freeze to the bottom. We lost our plants, our water lilies, everything. So it depends on year to year, but generally you get away with anything over a foot and a half deep. More likely to cause death to your fish is going to be oxygen depletion, and if a pond freezes over and stays that way for more than a week, you'll get a buildup of carbon dioxide from rotting plant debris and so on, and even fish fecal matter that isn't going to be exchanged with oxygen, and you can end up having fish suffocate in the pond. Anything that keeps an opening will work pretty well. We've over the years tended to use aerators more than anything else. An air pump that's bubbling air up to the surface, and generally those with a pond that has one of those in it, it does not totally freeze over unless the temperature gets below about 5 below zero. Has been our experience, 0 to 5 below, or even colder Fahrenheit. Sometimes they'll freeze over, and then usually it's only overnight or for a day or two, and as long as it opens back up in a couple, 3 days, you're in good shape. Heaters can also be used. There are pond heaters, there are stock tank heaters, there are a variety of things that will work. Of course, in any of these, you're working with electricity outdoors, so make things sure everything is properly secured against water getting into your electrical components. You can have tropical fish outside in your garden ponds, but these fish are only going to do well when temperatures are, depending on the fish, above 65 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Essentially, any fish will do well in temperatures above 70. And most of them will do well at temperatures above 65. You want to make sure that if you've got tropical fish in your body of water, in your pond, or mosquito fish for that matter, the gambusia I mentioned before, you want to put them only in ponds that do not have any outflow. You don't want to have the fish getting out and possibly becoming an ecological problem. Mosquito fish or gambusia, although they've been highly touted in the past, we now know are major problems in feeding on other fish eggs and causing problems that direction. And they can reduce the native component in those bodies of water where they are not native. Gambusia or mosquito fish occur naturally in Illinois, at least in the southern half of the state. But in the northern half, generally do not, and even in some areas where they are normally found, they may not be present in particular bodies of water where they could be a problem. They have a tendency to eat the eggs of bass and sunfish, so that tends to upset fishermen to a great extent, even though they're common in a lot of lakes that have those. I've shown some fish that I know of friends that have had very good luck with these particular fish: giant danios, tiger barbs, and yellow labs, which are a type of cichlid. But again, they're not put out until the temperature gets warm and taken in before it gets too cool. Essentially, realize that it has to be above 65 or 70. Moving on to some other pests. Oh, by the way, on fish, you want to make sure that fish are able to get into the shallows in order to give a good job of controlling mosquito larvae. So if you got emergent plants around the edge of a pond, such as cattails and some of those other types of plants that tend to build up and get up near the surface a lot, you want to make sure there's enough water above those root systems that the fish can get in and feed on any mosquito larvae that might be hanging in that area. Otherwise, of course, they can survive in very shallow areas. Generally, you also want to build your pond such you don't have real shallow areas in the pond. This increases mosquitoes being able to survive in those very shallow areas where fish can't reach. And I'll have a few other things to say about the problem with shallow pond edges towards the end of the talk when we get to mammal problems. Japanese beetles can feed on your water plants. They can feed on water lily, hyacinths, water hyacinths, other emergent plants. They're not going to go below the surface, so only the above ground parts of the plants are going to be fed upon. They'll eat them away and cause brown edges on the leaves, holes in the leaves, this sort of thing. Probably the best way to control them is to just go out there every other day or so and hand pick them. You can grab them off by hand, or you can, or if a foliage is standing up above the water, such as with water hyacinths, then you can put a wide mouth jar that has some soapy water in it, and then and just kind of stick your finger at the bug, and the bug will just drop down into the bottle. Be very, very careful when you're doing this. You can also use rubbing alcohol in it, but either of those products are exceedingly toxic to fish, particularly the soap. You get a little bit of soap and water and you'll kill your fish real quick. So you've got to be very careful of that. And so the safe way is to just grab them with your fingers and pull them out, and then drop them in perhaps some soapy water or something of that nature. Aphids can also show up on water lilies, and that's where I've seen them most commonly, are on water lilies, and they will cause yellowish edges on the leaves. Sometimes the whole leaves have turned yellow. I've seen some of that before. The aphids that attack water lilies tend to be fairly dark in color, and water hyacinths, things of this nature. The damage can be put up with. Many times the numbers aren't too high, but if they get very high, an easy thing to do is just kind of reach over and grab a hold of a water lily pad and swish it in the water, causing the aphids to come off, and the fish will feed on them. You may get some aphid mummies. These will be aphids that are kind of rounded up into little brownish balls in the bottom photo, and these are from parasitic wasps. If you leave those alone, they'll have more wasps come out that will attack more aphids and help give you more control associated with that. Perhaps one of the more obvious type of damage to water lilies, particularly, is called by the water lily leaf cutter. This is a caterpillar, and no, we don't have much in the way of aquatic caterpillars, but we have some that will live on the dry parts of aquatic plants, and this is the most common one. You can see in the lower photograph there that the larva cuts out a piece of leaf and uses silk to tie it to the top of a water lily pad, and then lives underneath that pad, and will come out and feed on the leaves, or move around feeding on the leaves with that. And it takes a sharp eye, but you can see these little patches sticking up, and you can just grab a hold and remove the caterpillars. That helps reduce that problem considerably. There are some beetles, water lily leaf beetle, that can sometimes cause damage as well, although they tend to cause more elongate areas, and the larvae will sometimes live on the underside of a water lily leaf as well. So if you're getting damage on your water lilies and you think it looks like holes or edges eaten away, could be one of these insects, and just start looking very closely at the water lily leaf on the upper and lower sides, and you should be able to find the culprit. And again, hand removal is probably the best thing, because not only is soap and alcohol very toxic to fish, but so are insecticides. So you try to avoid using chemical insecticides if at all possible. Midges can be considered to be a problem. If you have particularly a larger pond that has a lot of debris in the bottom of it and so on, you can have large numbers of midges or bloodworms, midge larvae or bloodworms living in the debris in the pond bottom, and they will come out in large numbers and are heavily attracted to lights at night. So they are about the same size and shape as mosquitoes, but when they're sitting, their wings tend to be flat along their body, such as in the upper photo. But these can become very, very numerous, the sort of thing that you just have clouds of them showing up, which commonly occurs near sewage treatment plants and things of this nature. They really like a high amount of organic matter. If you've got a smaller pond that you can do something about the organic matter, it's small enough you can do something about it. If you got a lot of midges, many times just cleaning out the debris at the bottom of a pond once in a while will help a lot. There may be more efficient ways of doing it, but the way I've always done it is to use a dip net to to kind of just drag the bottom. You get a bunch of really clouds of water, but excuse me, once you get that debris out, it will kind of settle back down and be in much better shape. Okay, so generally midges are something that comes along with a pond. But if you have very high numbers, then try to do something about the debris in the bottom of a pond. One way to prevent that, by the way, is that if you live in an area such as I do, which is just out in the country, surrounded by corn and soybean country, the last few weeks it would have been a good idea to have a net across the top of your pond to catch all the corn leaves that blow all over and settle in your pond and then sink and then decompose and cause problems. Similarly, if you have trees that are nearby and the leaves are coming off of them, netting can be used across the top of the pond. What I use is bird netting that and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, about some of the bird pests that can be a problem. That's a way to kind of keep them out. Mayflies can become very numerous as well, and although they're normally not going to be that common in garden ponds, if you've got larger ponds, they can build up fairly high. And if you have one that has some current to it, it will become even more numerous with them. Essentially, mayfly naiads, or the immature stage of the mayflies, live on the pond bottom, and many of them feed on algae. Some feed on other insects. Not really much of a factor. Some feed on debris. But they really require clean water because they have gills on their external gills, and they don't do well under polluted water. We have lots of people who bought a house 20, 30, 40 years ago around a pond, and it was real fine until the water got clean enough that the fish could really live well in it. And then all of a sudden they started getting mayflies, and so the adult mayflies have two tails at the back end, cerci, and triangular wings in the bottom photo, and these can be very, very numerous. When you're seeing theirs about 2 inches long with tails, but others are as little as a quarter of an inch, and they can essentially just fog around the lights. And I get calls from people who say, I can't open my mouth when I go outdoors. I have a mouthful of mayflies. They come out in small, in a very short period of time, typically a couple weeks, three times during the growing season. So you kind of learn to adjust your life sometimes associated with that if you have them as a problem. But so these are something that can be a problem associated with a pond, but generally it's going to be larger ponds, something more we'd call like a small lake or a larger lake. Wasps and bees will take advantage of the water associated with a garden pond. They do the same for bird baths and just anywhere there is water. You may get a few more associated with a pond because if you got debris there, mud dauber wasps will collect the mud and to make their nests with. And if you don't have debris or mud, then they'll collect the water and mix it somewhere else with dirt or soil to make the mud that they need to make their nests. And so this is very common to see these around the edges, and really are only a factor for the most part, associated with shallow areas of ponds, but they will also collect the water off of water lilies. My ponds go straight in from the side. I don't get them much in the edges, but I do get them occasionally on rocks and on water lily leaves. And so the under honeybees collect water to cool nest in summer, it says from shore. The percent sign meant to be an ampersand, so that should be from shore and on water lily leaves. It took me a while to even figure out what the word that was going on there. But at any rate, they need the shallow water. They really don't hurt anything. They're just in there gathering some water. Honeybees will gather water during the hot days of summer, particularly if it's dry, to help cool their hives. Honeybees will sit at the entrance of a hive or just inside, regurgitate water and fan their wings across it, and essentially produce a current and cool the hive. So I get considerable number of calls of people getting concerned about honeybees around pool decks and garden ponds and things of this nature. Why are all the bees here? Well, they're put out a shallow pan of water, and they'll probably not be around your pond so much. They're not really much of a threat to sting when they're gathering water. They're only likely to sting if you're bothering their hive. Some things that really aren't a problem in a garden pond for the most part. Some insects that we see commonly are springtails. These are tiny little critters, typically about a 1/16 to an eighth of an inch long, kind of top out at a quarter of an inch, but there are a few that get much bigger than an eighth of an inch. They are so small and so light that they can sit on the water surface, and if they're disturbed, they'll jump off the surface of the water. They're so light in relationship to the water surface tension that they can actually use that surface tension as a surface to jump from. They feed on debris that falls on the water surface and is underneath the water surface, and really are not a threat to anything or anybody. So you just kind of live with them for the most part. So that's one of the things that you're likely to see. Some other surface insects are water striders and whirligig beetles. These are predatory insects, primarily feeding on the surface of the water. Water striders are very, very common. You're not likely to see whirligig beetles unless you have a larger pond, something that's a quarter to a half acre, something of that nature or larger. But water striders will show up in just about any small body of water. They do fly. Both types of insects fly, and they actually, in the water striders, they stand on the water surface and have hairs that help support them on the surface of the water. It's amazing to me that that a lot of the ponds that I have are actually just summertime ponds. They're stock tanks, polyethylene stock tanks that I fill my wife and I fill for the summertime. We've just finished emptying all of those. Last one was last Sunday. So as it's getting into the fall, but in this situation, it's amazing to me that normally I'm not putting water into the first stock tank for more than about 3 or 4 minutes before the first water strider shows up. They're apparently cruising around, just kind of anytime they see a new body of water, they go for it. So if you have water of any amount outside of in a cup, you're probably going to have a water strider in it. So they'll get in all sizes of water gardens. And again, not really a problem. They're not really a factor, although they're predatory. They're not going to go after fish or anything like that. There are some predatory water bugs that will go after fish, very small fish, hatchlings, fry, they're called, and they'll feed primarily on other insects. And being predatory, they will bite you if you handle them carelessly. Back swimmers will rest upside down underneath the water surface. They all these breathe atmospheric air, and so when disturbed, they will swim upside down, and their legs, 2 of the legs are very long and flattened like oars with hairs on them, and they will swim down towards the bottom and around. I find them kind of interesting to watch, but occasionally they'll grab a newly hatched fish, but most commonly going to be feeding on insects. Similarly, for giant water bugs, they have a very short siphon which goes to the surface. The water scorpion has a longer siphon which sticks up through the water surface, and both of these have raptorial front legs, and their main thing in life is finding other critters to feed on. Particularly the giant water bugs, there are several different kinds. Most common ones are about 1 inch long, but there are some that get up 2 inches, 2.5 inches long. Those will go after larger fish, but the smaller ones not really much of a problem. Neither are the water scorpions. They're probably going to feed on primarily other insects. They're part of a biota. You kind of get used to them. There's some water beetles. The adult beetles usually aren't much of a problem. Predaceous starving beetle, water scavenger beetles, if they're feeding on anything, any other live critters, they're very, very small. But the immature stages can go after very young fish, very small fish, but they primarily feed on other insects. The predaceous diving beetle larva is called a water tiger for good reason. It will bite you quicker than you can think if you pull one out and have it in your fingers. And so will the larval stage of water scavenger beetles. But they really kind of just show up. The beetles will fly in, they'll lay eggs, and there'll be some in there. I've never seen them really be a major factor on reducing baby fish or anything of this nature, reducing the fry. But so you just kind of get used to them. There's really not much you can do about it anyway, so it's easier just to coexist. Dragonflies and damselflies normally fall in that same category. Normally you have a few in the pond. The damselfly naiads are in the bottom center and the dragonfly naiad in the lower left. They are predatory. They will feed on very small fish, hatchling fish, but normally not too numerous. It depends on location, I guess, to a great extent. In my ponds, out in the country and surrounded by farming area, I always have a few adult dragonflies and damselflies flying around in the summertime, and I find them kind of neat. I'm only about a half a mile away from a major river, so a creek that goes to a major river. So they are around and will show up. However, I have a friend that lives in Champaign who he probably lives similarly distanced from the closest body of water that would have these in them, and he gets in his he has stock tanks, and he'll find hundreds of them within the tank, and they probably are in those numbers a problem somewhat feeding on the baby fish he's trying to raise, which is what he has them set there for. But generally, he's the only person I've run across that has large numbers of these, and generally I look at them as being a nice addition to the ponds. I enjoy watching the dragonflies and damselflies flit around, and they are beneficial in that stage. In that dragonfly, another common name for them is mosquito hawk, and that is well founded. They will feed on mosquitoes, midges, this sort of thing. Getting past insects and getting into some relatives of insects, there are spiders that will live on or associated with water. And probably the most common one that we see is Dolomedes. It's a fairly large spider. It'll get a leg span of about 2 to 2.5 inches. And it's kind of neat looking, I think. It's blackish on the abdomen with some silvery white spots. And it will run on the water surface just like water striders. Just like water striders, it can dive below to capture insects and so on. I've never associated them with much on feeding on fish. I think they're primarily going to just feed on primarily insects and other critters that get stuck in the water surface when they happen to drop out of the sky as flying across. So not really much of a factor, although a spider that large and moves that fast can kind of give you the heebie-jeebies if it comes running up your arm or up your leg when you're working associated with your pond, but you just kind of have to live with these sorts of things. That's part of nature. Tetragnathids are very slender-looking spiders. They spin webs on emergent plants and parts of a plant to stick up above the water and feed on insects, and really aren't, although being associated with ponds, really aren't don't live in the pond at all or on the pond like Dolomedes does. Fishing spider is another term for Dolomedes. Crayfish will show up pretty much if you have a body of water that has a shoreline to it. There are several species of crayfish that wander around at night across the ground, and they'll walk across your lawn or and so on at night, and find your pond. There are the species that do this are primarily stream and pond crayfish, and if they're within a quarter or half a mile, they will probably find your body of water. Uh, and uh, and on rainy nights, particularly when they can keep their gills underneath the carapace moist, they will wander around considerable distance. Obviously, they cannot fly. No, have no wings. They have limited abilities to crawl. They kind of have to. If they can't reach it from the ground, the top of a fence, they can't get over it. And so, any sort of a solid fence made out of boards or something of this nature, or uh, galvanized roofing material, or any other types of metal that's stuck down in the ground a half an inch or an inch and sticks up at least 6 inches above, preferably maybe 8 feet, 8 inches to close to a foot. Will keep any crayfish out of a body of water. They can't get over that type of thing. They're omnivores. They'll feed on debris primarily, dead plants and animals, but some will feed on live plants to a certain extent, a small amount. They'll feed on insects. They'll feed on fish. And since they tend to be nocturnal, if you have fish that tend to sleep next to the bottom, they'll nail one occasionally. So again, they're there's not much you can do about them except net them out once you get them in the pond. They do live on the bottom, and so if you get a bunch of crayfish in a garden pond, by running a net across the bottom, and then you can probably pull out most of them. You'll get some fish too, but you can put those back in, and this will help reduce the number of crayfish. If they really become a problem, you just try to keep them out. If your pond is if you've got a pond that has that is more above, has part of it above ground. If you have a sharp edge on the on your above ground part, this will keep them out on its own that direction. Snails will show up essentially in any garden pond. They'll come in on plants that you as eggs that you or snails themselves in any type of plants that you bring in. If you have a large enough pond that you get ducks or other waterfowl coming to even occasionally, they'll carry them in on their feet and their legs, and so pretty soon you're going to have snails in a body of water. Just about all you can say about that. They're normally not a major problem as long as they're not too numerous. And will feed on algae, feed on debris. They're general scavengers for the most part, and not going to be much of a factor. They become very numerous. They can be unsightly. They can feed on some of your water plants. There are some fish that will feed on them. Many of the sunfish are snail feeders. In fact, a common name for the red ear sunfish is shell cracker. Uh, Supposedly, if you're sitting, you can almost hear them crunching them. Um, in aquaria that I've had central mud minnow is a relatively common native fish in Illinois, as well as the smaller versions of of catfish called mad toms. Any of these catfish or the central mud minnow will clear you out of of snails. When I've kept mad toms before in aquaria, typically after a few months, I notice that I have this big, quite a large collection of empty snail shells towards the central front of my tank. So, the question that's come about is snails in a freshwater aquarium. You can use these types of fish, although red ear sunfish will get up to about 10 inches long, which means they're probably bigger than most aquaria can handle. And if they're not too big, then they may eat the other fish that you have in the tank. But these other smaller fish are normally very compatible with other fish in the tank. Usually not too much. The central mud minnow is a predator, so are all catfish. But generally, as long as they're not a lot larger than the other fish, they're not a problem feeding on those other fish. One option for an aquarium, I am an aquarist, by the way, have 40 aquariums in my house. Not really big numbers compared to some of my friends, but more than most people have. Uh, there are, for tropical fish aquariums, there are snails called assassin snail. They're actually a freshwater conch, and conchs are predatory on other snails. And if you get some assassin snails, which you can buy at the local fish store, put them in your aquarium, they will clean out the other snails. Now, they are snails themselves, being predatory snails that prefer to feed on other snails. They will feed on debris. Even though they may clean out the tank, they normally don't reproduce very heavily and don't overwhelm the tank with snails. So using predatory snails, assassin snails, will help control that. You would not want to put assassin snails in an outdoor pond. You don't want those to have any chance of getting away in nature. And snails can kind of come out at night and crawl across surfaces. So you don't want to risk that chance of that happening. Frogs. Depending on the frogs you have, they may be something that you want or don't want. If you have small kids, they may get really excited watching the big tadpoles. Bullfrog tadpoles get up to about 3 inches long, and they take a couple years to develop into adult frogs, and they can be lots of fun for kids to watch, and so I can see where people might want to have them. Bullfrogs usually are not something you're really going to want to have, or their smaller cousin, the green frog. They look very similar in appearance, except the green frog only gets about half the size of bullfrog. Bullfrogs, with their legs stretched out, get to be about a foot long. The part without the legs, the front part of the animal, 5 or 6 inches, 4 or 5 inches long probably. Green frogs probably about 3 to 4 inches, and they, particularly bullfrogs, the males will make a lot of noise at night. They will keep you awake at night unless you like to hear sounds like somebody blowing a horn all night long, or at least in the evening. When we find them in our ponds, we normally catch Froggy and take him for a one-way trip. Essentially, you can go out at night. You can use a strong light, and you can kind of freeze them for a few seconds while you net them, and then take them to another body of water, hopefully the one they came from. We normally take ours about 2 miles away and release them, and we don't notice them coming back, so that seems to work relatively well. But again, frogs are going to show up no matter if you've got a body of water. Smaller frogs are usually fairly common. They normally are not much of a problem. The bigger frogs will eat other frogs. They will they'll eat fish. They essentially eat anything that they can get in their mouths. There's been some studies that found out that bullfrogs are pretty good at eating mice, for instance. So just about anything that a frog can eat, they will eat. And but the smaller ones are mainly going to be insect feeders, and the larger ones are mainly insect feeders as well. And they're kind of interesting. They kind of chirp if you scare them and they jump in the water. They can have a nice, pleasing song. They feed on mosquitoes and other insects, moths, etc. So they're kind of interesting. And the cricket frogs are very small frogs, typically about an inch long, maybe an inch and a half. Green tree frogs will be in the trees, and their tadpoles or pollywogs will be down in the body of water. They'll lay their eggs there, and they're usually kind of interesting. Have a nice trill to them. Leopard frogs are larger frogs. They're going to be a couple inches long, maybe 2.5 to 3 inches long, but again are primarily insect feeders and not going to be a problem feeding on your fish like bullfrogs and green frogs are. Toads. We kind of know when it's spring when the toads show up. They seem to be able to come from a distance around. I have seen them several hundred feet away from my pond on a beeline towards my pond. I don't know how they know where it is, but they do. I even tried picking up a toad, turning them around and around, facing the other direction, and immediately they go straight towards the pond. In the spring, their drive to find a body of water, mate and lay eggs in the pond, will hatch into tadpoles, is very, very strong. They have a very high-pitched trill. And if you have a number of them, like we have our pond, It holds about 1,000 gallons, our main pond, and it's no more than about 30 feet from our bedroom window. It's noticeable. And in the evening and into the night, uh, we've learned how to adjust to it and just sleep to it, but other people find it overwhelming. Uh, the biggest problem that I find with toads in the pond is drowned toads. When you get some amorous males, they'll stack on top of a female, push her down under the water so much that she drowns. Maybe even the first male may drown under in there, and you'll find drowned toads in your pond. You need to be watchful of those. Get those out because they'll pollute your water. Tadpoles can be very numerous. They're primarily algae feeders, particularly when they're young. Then as they get older, they'll feed on their tail. And you get very tiny little toads, about a quarter of an inch long, trying to get out of your pond. They will drown if they don't have a shallow area to crawl out, or what we put in our ponds are what we call toad ladders. Essentially, it's a bent over piece of hardware cloth, half-inch or quarter-inch hardware cloth that extends down into the water, and they can climb out on that and get out of the ponds. Even our in-ground ponds are such that there's enough of a gap between the water and the top of the rocks we have around it that they can't really get out very well, and so that works well for helping the young toads get out. Young frogs can jump out, but young toads don't seem to do very well that way. If you want to keep them out of your pond, again, toads can't fly and they can't jump very high, not near as high as frogs. You'd have to have a pretty good high solid fence to keep frogs out of a pond, but probably something that's 8 inches a foot high will keep toads out without any trouble at all. But you will have frustrated adult toads coming to your pond and not being able to get to it. It's all in how you look at things. Snakes. There are various snakes that will go into a body of water. Garter snakes will go into a body of water to eat fish and frogs. And then we have snakes that are normally water snakes, such as the northern water snake and other types of water snakes. Generally, water snakes, ones that live in water normally, have a nasty disposition, and most of them are not venomous. The only one is water moccasins that are venomous, and I think it's a testimony to the nastiness of most water snakes, particularly the northern water snake, which has a color pattern somewhat similar to a water moccasin, does not have a triangular head of a water moccasin, or cottonmouth, that tends to get the name of, and people think that they're water moccasins. I've lived in southern Illinois. I grew up in central Illinois. I live in central Illinois now, a different part of central Illinois. I've lived in northern Illinois. Every place in Illinois I've gone to, local people swear up and down they have water moccasins. The fact of the matter is, water moccasins only occur in Illinois in about the southern 40 miles of the state. And they just really don't occur any farther north. In fact, the northernmost area that they occur in Illinois, the most common place is Pine Hills and LaRue Swamp area. They're actually protected because they are farther north there than anywhere else in the United States. So although the water moccasins go farther north in Illinois and they go pretty much any other state, they don't go into the most of the state of Illinois. Illinois is 400 miles long, and 360 miles of it do not have water moccasins, okay? But I grew up in a town south of Springfield. Oh, they got water moccasins out there in that pond. Yeah, it's water moccasins out there. Now, they had northern water snakes, and most water snakes would just as soon bite you as look at you. So they're really nasty attitude. A good high solid fence will exclude them. Realize the fence has to be higher than the snake is long. And so in my experience, I've kept snakes before. They can support their body, particularly against an upright such as a fence, probably for almost their entire length, at least as much as they only need probably 4 to 6 inches on the ground to support their body. And if there happens to be any boards in that fence, vertical boards, they'll support even a little bit higher than that. And so if they can get their head over the top, they can move the rest of their body across. So if you're trying to keep snakes out, you've got to have a fairly tall fence. I would think in terms of something that's 2.5 feet, maybe 3 feet high, a board fence to keep them out, in order to keep them out. And if it's very rough, they'll walk up the side of it. So they'll move up the side of the fence. So something that's made out of bricks or rock, they'll go right over that. That's not a problem, no matter how high it is. So if you're trying to keep them out, realize that. It's unusual to have snakes in a garden pond. Usually they're going to be more common in bigger bodies of water, ponds that are over, quarter of an acre or more in size. Turtles will get into any garden pond that you have. They will eat fish. They'll eat plants. I had a different friend that lived in a nearby town. He lived near the Sangamon River, and he had problems with turtles eating his water lilies all to pieces. And when you live within a couple hundred feet of a river, you're not going to be able to keep turtles out for the most part, except a solid fence will kind of keep them out. Many people will like to have ponds and certain turtles in their pond, particularly the sliders, the painted turtles, the red-eared turtles. These sorts of things are kind of neat to see sitting on a log or on the side of a pond, and they're kind of neat looking. They will feed on fish, but the sliders are probably not much of a problem. Painted turtles, not much of a problem. But certainly snapping turtles can be. We got one in our pond just this last summer. Pretty well eliminated our goldfish in that pond over the span of a few weeks. So, and all turtles will tend to migrate, and snapping turtles particularly will migrate from one body of water to another. And as I mentioned earlier, our only body of water that's near us is probably a half a mile away that would have snapping turtles in it. But we find one in our pond every couple 3 years, so they move a considerable distance in order to find a body of water, and they will show up occasionally. You just kind of have, if you don't want them, you have to kind of have to catch them and get them out. You can tell if you have a turtle in your pond, if it doesn't come out of the water, is that they are air-breathing animals. And if you keep an eye on your pond, you'll notice them sticking the tip of their head out, their snout, and you can notice them from that standpoint that you have turtles. And like I say, if you really care about your fish, you probably don't want to have a snapping turtle in your pond. Canada geese. The Canada goose is pretty widespread. Not a problem on small bodies of water, but if you got a pond that's an acre or more in size, you're very likely to get Canada geese. Canada goose, it's a vegetarian primarily on grasses and so on, and so it really likes when people put lawns next to ponds. It's just, the pond is a source of refuge for it, place to raise their young, and the lawn grass is just perfect food for it. So they would get along quite well with houses around ponds. Their fecal matter is a major problem. Their fecal matter is a couple 3 inches long and quarter to half an inch in diameter, and they seem to produce an awful lot of it. Being vegetarians, they do so, and so they can make things slick from their fecal matter. And if you have small children or small pets, they can be pretty aggressive towards them too. So they can be kind of nasty at times. The thing that really can keep Canada goose or Canada geese out of a body of water is that they like to be able to run off of land into the pond or into the body of water very quickly when they feel threatened by a dog or anything else that they see as a threat. And it's hard for them to take off and get up into the air. They're slow. And so generally they will not live next to a pond that they can't easily get into. And you can see the short fence here in the lower photo, and that's all you need to keep Canada geese out of your pond. If that little short fence that's maybe only a foot tall is something that they have to get at least slightly airborne to get over, and that makes them nervous as all get out, and they're not going to stay there. They're going to go somewhere where they don't have a little fence, or some shrubbery. Some people even have good luck if you want to have a natural look of having tall plants, native vegetation near the pond, right up to the pond edge. It sticks up a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet high. That'll keep geese out of it as long as it's a pretty thick barrier. Even emergent plants along the side will normally keep them out. For instance, I don't think I've ever seen Canada geese next to a body of water that had arrowhead or water willow or any of these other emergent plants. They only stick a foot or so above the water, and they're growing in the water. But it's something that slows a goose that's running from a predator, slows them down enough. They'll go somewhere else. So any sort of a barrier next to that pond will pretty well keep geese out as being a problem. And again, they're only a problem on bigger ponds. Kingfishers can be a problem no matter how small your pond is. Or at least it seems that way. If you've got something that's only 2 or 3 feet across, you may get a resident kingfisher feeding on your fish. And these are relatively small birds. They're going to be, 8 inches or so long, maybe a foot. They're bluish and have a white collar, and the belted kingfisher, the one that's native here. If you notice in that picture, it's got a really thin, sharp beak, and that's meant for catching fish with. And they tend to go after minnows or fish that are probably less than 6 inches long. And so they're not probably going to be a problem if you've got large koi, but if you've got smaller fish, even ones that you put in there as bait minnows, they're essentially fishing in a barrel, and it's not hard for them to to completely clean you out. They like to sit on some sort of support above the pond. So if you happen to have a electrical wire or something running above the pond or near it, or a tree that's over the pond, that's usually all you need. You take the pond fish and something to sit on above the pond. Sooner or later, you're probably going to get kingfishers. And like I said, they will clean your pond out. You can put netting across it, but the best thing is to site your pond where you don't have overhead wires or trees. If you're trying to grow water lilies or water lotus, you need to have several hours of sunlight to the to that pond to help keep those plants going well, which means you're not going to put it near a tree. That has another advantage, that you're not going to have as many leaves falling into your pond in the fall, causing some organic issues, dead organic problems. So generally you try to site your pond out in the open. I realize you can't move a pond once you have one if it's in the ground very easily, but we have one that it was essentially a concrete stock tank that had a wire running across, and we got a kingfisher, and he pretty well cleaned out that pond, which probably held 1,500 gallons of water or so. So it took him about 3 weeks to totally clean that pond out, and he'd come back and forth, and so they can be pretty devastating if you're trying to keep fish. Great blue herons can be even more so, but they tend to be a little more cagey and less likely to come into an area. We've had them even feeding off of fish in our stock tank ponds. And they have a long, sharp bill that they can spear fish with. These are going to go after primarily larger fish and frogs and pretty much anything else they can catch. They'll eat muskrats. They'll eat anything. But they will feed on fish primarily, and they stab them with their bill. When they miss, they can puncture your lining to your pond. If you've got a polyethylene lining, they can puncture that lining and cause your pond to lose water. That's kind of rough. Interesting feature about great blue herons, and these are a very large bird. They have a wingspan. I don't know what it is. I'm guessing it's 4 to 5 feet, maybe even larger than that. And so these are large birds, and they are solitary, so you'll typically only have one. And that's one thing you can use to help reduce the problem with great blue herons, is that you have something that looks like a great blue heron next to your pond, a decoy. Um, Decoys will bring in ducks, but they repel herons if it's a heron decoy. And so you can buy uh, any, ones that like the one in the picture. It's all colored up and looks more like a heron. You can buy even cheaper heron decoys um, from water plant catalogs and things of this nature. Um, you can buy bronze ones that you can use as statuary next to your pond, and they have a double help, and that is that not only do they add something to your pond appearance, but they also help keep more real herons away from your pond. Netting over the pond will help as well. And again, um, what I've used before is a netting that you can buy for keeping birds out of cherry trees and things of this nature, bird netting for that. You can also buy pond netting, and to me it looks almost identical. It's a little bit heavier and a lot more expensive, but either of them will work pretty well. Ducks, you can get mallards showing up at a larger pond. If it's at least a quarter to a half an acre, you're likely to get mallards coming in. And if it's a smaller pond like that, the amount of fecal matter, depending on the amount of ducks, can end up being a problem. Uh, the wood duck, and up in the upper right, as well as, and particularly its cousin from the other side of the world, the mandarin duck, are sometimes kept in ponds as ornaments, essentially. You have ornamental fish, you can have ornamental ducks. And the male wood duck and mandarin ducks look like they've been painted up with all kinds of bright colors. They nest in nesting boxes, wood nesting boxes, and over the pond, or even in trees nearby, and we'll go to the pond. Probably some of you have seen wildlife special shows in which they show little baby nestling ducks. When they get to a certain stage, they just fall out of a tree, sometimes from a pretty high distance, and they're so light that they're able to do that, and then they get to the water. So these are something that you may want to have, or you may not want to have, depending on your attitude. Keeping them out, if you've got a small pond that's where the fecal matter becomes a problem, is not an easy thing. You can get to help reduce them from being too numerous. You can get a variance from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources for mallards to as well as for Canada geese to destroy their eggs. So spin their eggs or coat their eggs with vegetable oil to keep from hatching. If you remove the eggs, they just lay more eggs. But if they have eggs that don't hatch, they keep sitting on them, and you don't get a lot more there. That's a whole different topic, but because generally for most garden ponds, these aren't going to be a factor. We get into mammals, and raccoons and cats can kind of fish your ponds out. They'll kind of they'll feed on fish, they'll feed on frogs, they'll feed on whatever they can find. And both cats and raccoons will come to the edge, raccoons even more so, and they'll kind of dip their paw in the water and kind of make it stir it up a little bit. And particularly for your fish that you're used to feeding by throwing fish food on the surface of a pond, that'll cause making the fish come up when the surface is disturbed like that. Particularly goldfish and other fish tend to come up looking for something to eat, and then they'll grab them and feed on them. And then raccoons will also wash food in their pond, and can on a small pond they could be somewhat of a problem polluting the pond. Interesting feature is the red tabby in the lower right corner. That's a cat that we had that somehow developed a taste for algae. And you can see that cat looks a little on the scrawny side, toe's not in real good shape. That's because he's been feeding almost exclusively on algae. He's a predator, and he doesn't have a digestive system for it. Tried to get him to eat cat food, and we couldn't get him to hardly eat them. Eventually, he got real finny and skinny, and we finally blocked him out of the pond to where he had to eat something else, and it's the only way we could save his life. So cats are strange. They can do darn near anything. I've never seen one before that developed a taste for algae over all other things. So that's an interesting, different thing. But generally, we're concerned about cats feeding on fish. Dogs will jump into the pond, and particularly if it's a retriever, something that's been bred to go into water, and Labrador retrievers, golden retrievers, something's been bred to go after waterfowl and so on. They will like to go into bodies of water, and they'll get into your pond, and unfortunately their toenails can puncture your polyethylene liners and cause real damage to the pond. Fencing around will help keep them out, these sorts of things. So generally, but the most effective thing generally for keeping dogs and cats or raccoons out of a pond, is having a sharp drop off at the edge. I've seen them do it before. Generally, any of these will kind of stick their paw down into the water an inch or two, maybe even 3 or 4 inches. I've seen them go as deep as 6 inches, and if they can't touch bottom, normally they don't go in. And so it's commonly, ponds are built so that you have somewhere with an 8 to 1 foot inch shelf down below the edge of a pond that you can put pots that will have emergent plants in, such as cattails or arrowhead and some of these sorts of things. And if you have that sort of structure in your pond, you probably won't have any problem with dogs or with raccoons or cats. I don't think anything will keep a Labrador retriever out of a pond except a fence. So if they really love the water, they'll go in regardless of what the edge is. But you can keep raccoons and cats from being a problem from being much of a problem associated with having a drop off at the edge. But they will still dabble the water and try to fish out your fish if they can. So you kind of have to have a trade-off between those two. Fences around the outside will keep any of these out. Electric fence works well. We're not talking about a high voltage thing that's dangerous to children or anything like this. You can buy fences that will recharge off solar panels or keep their charge from batteries, and they're typically running no more than 6 volts or 12 volts. And if you grab a hold of one of that strand with your hands, you can feel kind of a pulse, but it's not a problem shock to most people. You have one strand down at about 6 inches above the ground, the next one about 12 inches above the ground. This keeps things from crawling under the fence or stepping over it in the way of raccoons, dogs, or cats, and can keep the animals out of a pond. I've seen some. I don't know how common they are now, but in years past, even had decorative fencing that you could electrify that would be very effective and be decorative as well, and help keep these critters out of your pond. And finally, if you've got a very large pond or even a lake, you can have muskrats tunneling into the dams and banks, and eventually they'll burrow in for the burrows they live in, and can cause leaks that go all the way through. If you go to larger lakes where you have a dam, you'll notice that generally on the dam side, at least on the lake side, next to the dam of earthen dams, they will have a lot of what they call rickrack, which is usually limestone rock that's been put in there, fairly large boulder-sized things, 4, 6, 10, 12, 16, 20 inches across. And what this does is this keeps muskrats from tunneling into that dam and eventually weakening that dam to where you can end up having dam failure. That's probably the best reason for why they do it. They also do it to help reduce erosion from wave action on larger lakes. But they will feed on aquatic plants. You're usually not going to have much of a problem with muskrats unless you have a very large pond. So here's my contact information associated with that. You have that associated with a handout if you've got that, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have at this point. Says, will the electric fence work against mink as well as raccoons? If I had mink, I'd probably lower the bottom strand to probably 3 inches, or maybe even as low as 2 inches, although it's hard to keep the grass cut underneath something that low. Probably about 3 inches or 4 inches, which should keep mink out. Mink are in the weasel family, and they will they can be a problem if they decide to find go after fish. So yeah, the electric fence will work. If my main problem was mink, I would probably think in terms of some sort of a fence that was a foot to 2 feet high, something that would be high enough to put a barrier to the mink, but short enough that I could step over it to get to the pond, and have it probably set back a couple 3 feet from the pond edge, maybe even a little bit farther. And then I would probably run a strand of electric either on the outside around the middle of that fence or towards the top. Electric fences are not meant to harm, but they're meant to deter. And electric fences work primarily with the idea that a wet nose is what's going to touch that fence first. And that's going to provide a nice ground and cause them a real nice snap to their nose. Without hurting them, it will keep them away. So yeah, I didn't think of mink when I was putting this presentation together. Had some nice mink pictures from my chicken house, but I didn't think of it. That would have been a good addition in this. But you're a good question. Ha! Wants to know where I keep 40 aquariums. Well, I have let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4 in my living room, and the other 36 are in my basement. So I have some large stands made of 4x4s and 2x4s that, as well as some wrought iron, a piece of wrought iron stand from a fish store that I keep most of my tanks on. My largest tank, well, we just got a new tank that's larger than anything else we've had. It's 120 gallons. The smallest one is 2.5 gallons. Most of my tanks are anywhere from 5 gallons to 30 gallons. Most of them are in that stance. And I've been the president of a local fish club for years, so I've been into fish for a long time.
Hey, Phil, there was a question. It said, I have snails in my freshwater aquarium. Can the fish you mentioned be put into the aquarium to get rid of the snails?
I did answer that earlier. I saw it come up.
Okay,
and what I recommended was that you can use the sunfish will probably eat all your other fish, but unless you have very large fish, but any of the catfish, native catfish, particularly the mad toms, which stay small, and the central mud minnow will clean them out. And I've kept them in mixed aquaria before with tropical fish and gotten rid of snails that way. But I primarily mentioned that there's a freshwater conch that which are predatory snails on other snails, and called assassin snails, which you can buy at fish stores, and you can put those in, and they don't reproduce near like other snails, and they will clean out your snails. I had a 55-gallon tank with rosy barbs in it in my basement that had, at one time I think I pulled 250 snails out of it, just ones that were obvious. And I put half a dozen assassin snails in there, and I can't find any snails in that tank today. So that was a couple years ago. So they would do a very good job on that. While we're waiting for somebody else to answer a question, I thought I might share with you my first outdoor pond happened to be an area in the ground that I dug, uh, and in the backyard, and I lined it with plastic that we had used before to put on our windows to keep the cold out in the wintertime. And I had sunfish in it, and eventually a bird found them, and I found all kinds of dead parts of sunfish in there. I'm not sure what bird it was. My guess is that the way it looked, it was probably a kingfisher, because it was in the shade of an overhanging tree. So, um, and I would think I was seventh grade at that time, maybe eighth grade. And once I got my own property, we had a lot more ponds, and my wife's into fish and outdoor ponds as well. So we have a good old time at it. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your attention. I think we'll